The entire basis of Inside Out runs on the idea that our emotions are sentient beings that help influence us to make the right choices. And a concept like that is really nothing new for Pixar, considering they've come up with such ideas as toys being alive when people aren't around, monsters who scare children for energy, and superheroes being legally banned. But unlike most of Pixar's movies, the inherent concept of Inside Out can lead to various questions about the logistics behind what we see and how it's all supposed to work. And today, I'd like to explain how Pixar's approach to Inside Out could have arguably been done better if more thought was put into the overall concept. And needless to say, there will be spoilers for both Inside Out and Inside Out 2 ahead. So in case you haven't seen either of them yet and don't want to know what happens, you probably shouldn't proceed with this video. This is the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so I already addressed this issue with the original Inside Out in my video, The Pixar Problem Part 4, World Building, which you can find a link in the description to, and specifically went over how focusing more on Riley's actual thought process could have helped the overall concept make more sense. Because when you really look at it, if our emotions are sentient and the ones actually controlling our actions, then doesn't that rob us of our agency? And if little people in our minds are dictating everything we do, are we even responsible for our own actions? Now, as I noted in the aforementioned video, Don Bluth even said he didn't like the movie for that exact reason, because it implies we have no free will. And in many ways, that is true. Because from what's shown in the movies, it appears that the humans are basically slaves to their emotions and are compelled to do whatever they want. And that's just not how it works in real life. Now, I know I said in my video on Inside Out 2, which you can also find a link in the description to, that the sequel does a better job of establishing Riley as a person independent of her emotions, but frankly it only does the bare minimum in this regard. Like when she fights anxiety's urge to abandon her friends. Things like that should be shown happening way more often, because people are constantly in conflict with their emotions. I mean, just because our emotions tell us to do something, that doesn't mean we automatically do it. Just because we're so angry we feel like killing somebody, that doesn't mean we kill them. The whole point of maturity is learning how to control your emotions and not always doing what they're telling you to. And yet, from what we see in both movies, most of the time any given person will do exactly what their emotions want them to, and that's just not realistic. And moreover, they'll sometimes behave a certain way because of something that the emotions are doing, regardless of outside context. Like when Riley abruptly feels sad when breaking into the coach's office, or reacting in fear for being asked how school went simply because he touched the console. I mean, if the audience wasn't being shown what was going on in her head, would that make any sense? Because, like I've already pointed out a few times, that's not how people in the real world behave. But even more than that, and as I also brought up in that Pixar video, all of this makes it look like the emotions are controlling Riley a lot more than was intended. I mean, fear touches the console and she gets scared, even if she has no reason to. And that's why the moral about the importance of sadness can fall flat for some people, because it almost looks like Joy is doing Riley a favor by preventing her from being sad. And it's not like she's ever shown suffering any negative consequences from not feeling sad. Even at the end, when she almost falls into depression, that's because only her most negative emotions had been influencing her for far too long, and the absence of her core memories have robbed her of her identity, not because she was deprived of sadness specifically. To put it simply, the movie does way too good a job at selling the importance of the emotions in Riley's head, to the point that it looks like they're controlling her instead of simply trying to help her. As I said in my Inside Out 2 video, the scene at the end where Riley calls Joy to the console should not only have been in the first movie, but used heavily to help reinforce the movie's message that she needs to feel certain emotions to be truly happy, and not that she's simply a puppet to her emotions. Because the way it's presented, it feels like she hardly has control of herself. And going back to something I was saying before, about the character's actions sometimes being unexplainable without the context of what the emotions are doing, can also lead to some bigger questions as well. Because frankly, the emotions behave more like people than the actual human beings do. They actually have agency. Their actions actually make sense without the audience having to literally see inside their head to know what they're thinking. And it's like, per the logic of the movie, what makes them tick? Do they have a bunch of little emotions inside their heads to help them do what's best? Because based off how we see them behave, it doesn't seem likely. But to stay on topic, the point is that since the emotions seem to have more agency than the people they control, and that to a large extent the humans are controlled by the emotions, it makes one wonder if the people they inhabit are actually responsible for their actions or not. Like when Riley breaks into the office or accidentally hurts her friend at the end. Is that actually her fault or anxiety's? Because anxiety is a sentient being who understands the difference between right and wrong, as well as that there are potential consequences for her actions. While Riley, though understanding all of that as well, is being compelled to do a lot of these things by another sentient force. So once again, who's really in control here? And moreover, who should be held responsible for her actions? Because once again, it's hard to argue that Riley's actions are truly her responsibility when anxiety, a sentient being, is doing everything she can to make her do what she does. In many ways, is what the emotions do all that different from outright mind control? What I'm trying to say here is, under any other circumstances, anybody would say without question that of course Riley is responsible for her own actions, and that to even try and suggest otherwise would only be making excuses for her. But considering the emotions behave more like people than humans do, having actual free will and completely unfiltered thinking skills, in contrast to the humans, and particularly Riley, who are shown on many occasions to do things that don't make any sense and are often the victims of their emotions' whims, makes one wonder if they can even truly be held accountable for the consequences of their actions. Because as I've already said, the emotions are completely sentient and know right from wrong, while the humans are portrayed as sometimes doing things just because a particular emotion wants them to, without any reason. So who's really in control here? Though, to be fair, it is stressed multiple times that Riley is her own person, and that no matter what the emotions do, they can't make her who they want her to be. So that does imply that Riley has free will and independent thinking from her emotions. But here's the thing. Who is Riley? If the emotions don't make her who she is, then what does? Because as I just noted, many times over the two movies, they say Riley is her own person. And to an extent, this is even shown. But where does it come from? Because her core memories are used to help forge her identity. And even her sense of self in the second movie is just an extension of that. All of that and her emotions are used to influence her, but we don't actually see her identity itself. And as a result, that only makes things even more confusing. Because simply put, the movies are trying to argue that Riley is her own sentient person with free will and wants and desires regardless of her emotions. But even apart from the aforementioned problem of her emotions being able to influence her a little too easily, there's also the fact that we only ever see her from the perspective of her emotions. I mean, if the audience was shown what she was like as a fellow human being, instead of as a vessel for the emotions to control, maybe the whole thing would make more sense. Or maybe even have a voiceover that helps the audience understand what she's actually thinking independently of her emotions' perspective. Because once again, especially the second movie makes it clear that she can think without them, but it's never explained how. Where does she think? What does she actually think? And where does it come from? Does it come from her soul, another part of her brain, or something else? To put it simply, Riley is only ever presented as a responsibility for her emotions to keep safe, rather than treated as an actual human being. And as a result, it's almost impossible to see her or get to know her as one. Now, obviously, one could argue that I'm reading way too much into all of this, and maybe I am. But that still doesn't change the fact that the whole concept behind Inside Out is extremely confusing and apt to leave one with a ton of unanswered questions if they do think about it hard enough. Because even if you want to disregard everything else I just said, one can't deny that human beings do not behave the way they do in those movies, and that the emotions end up acting more like people than the actual people do. Now listen, as a man who's written books, I'm not saying that every last detail in a story needs to be accounted for. I've even argued against reading too much into movies in several videos, even if I am guilty of doing it myself sometimes. But what makes this different is that the way the idea is presented opens doors to a lot of questions about the logic behind it and offers few satisfactory answers. Which ties into one of the biggest issues Pixar often has, that they'll always tell what they think is the best story possible, even if it means that the logic behind those stories is questionable at best, or downright non-existent at worst. And though that has actually worked out pretty well for some of their movies, don't get me wrong, Inside Out is one place where a few more explanations regarding the relationship between the emotions and humans would have been nice. Because as it stands, the whole thing doesn't make much sense if not taken at face value. Okay, I think that's everything I had to say on that. So now I'd like to hear your opinions. Do you believe that the inherent logic behind Inside Out and its sequel doesn't make a ton of sense when actually thought about? Or do you think it all makes perfect sense and that I'm reading way too much into it? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And remember, You don't have to agree with anything I said in this video just because you watched it. You can feel about Inside Out and how it handles the logic of its concept however you want to, and if you think I was completely wrong, that is totally okay. And thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.